Welcome everybody to our talk today on modern Iran. Let me just take a couple minutes to introduce our speakers today, as well as to welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your patience as well for joining us. If you're joining us from China, thank you for spending your evening here with us. If you're joining us from the US very early in the morning, let me first say a little bit about our center, Yale Center Beijing. We've been around for a few years now, since 2014, and our goal is to bring together the best of Yale, but also just scholars and practitioners and leaders from around the world to discuss interesting topics that span from economics to politics, of course, but also from art to biology, to philosophy, to history, you name it, we've done it. And so we're very happy to have today's program join our roster of almost 100 events a year. And of course, in the last couple of years, we've done many Zoom talks, which the nice blessing in disguise of having to do everything on Zoom is we're able to have quite a variety of different people join us, not just in Beijing, but from all over the world. And so thank you all for joining us. As a quick reminder, we will have a quick talk by Professor Amanat, and then a response by Professor Ji, and then they'll have some questions to discuss, and then we'll also open up questions to the audience. And so if you have questions, please feel free to leave them in the chat box below on the Zoom function, and I will do my best to make sure we get to the relevant questions. Again, thank you for joining us, and let me introduce our two speakers today. So Professor Abbas Amanat is William Graham Sumner Professor Emeritus of History at Yale. He received his BA from Tehran University and his Doctorate of Philosophy from the School of Oriental Studies at the University of Oxford, and he's taught at Yale University until his very recent retirement in 2021. He is, of course, a prolific author and editor who's written about the early modern and modern history of Iran, the Middle East, the Muslim world, and the Persianate world. His books and articles are very numerous, such that I will not name them all here today. But I'm sure you guys are familiar. He served as editor-in-chief of Iranian Studies, as well as the Journal of the Association for Iranian Studies as well. He's been a recipient of many grants and is the Carnegie Scholar of Islamic Studies, the recipient of the Mellon Sawyer Grant, the Bahari Visiting Fellow in the Persian Art of Books at Bodleian Library at Oxford, the Christensen Fellow also at Oxford. So he's worn many hats, done many things. At Yale, he served as the director of the Qasim Ghani Project, as well as chair of the Council on Middle East Studies, and the director of the Yale Program in Iranian Studies at the Yale Macmillan Center. And he remains an active author and editor. He has multiple books coming out this year alone, as well as several more planned for 2023 and into the future. And I suspect that after this talk, he may have even more ideas on what else to write about. Professor Amanat's book, The History of Modern Iran, has been translated into Chinese and is recently published. And of course, we want to thank, of course, Duke Media Group, who is publishing the book in Chinese. And that book has been translated by Professor Kaiyun Ji, who is joining us today as well. He is currently Professor of World History at China Southwest University and the Director of the Center for Iranian Studies at Southwest University of China. He received his BA from Shanxi Normal University, his Master's in the History of the Middle East from Southwest University of China, and his PhD in History from Northwestern University of China. He has been a visiting scholar at the University of Tehran from 2004 to 2005, as well as a senior visiting scholar at the University of Illinois. He is the author of 5 books, which he was very happily showing Professor Amanat as you guys were all joining us today. And so very happy to have both of you join us. Thank you for joining us, and thank you the audience as well. I will turn it over to Professor Amanat for some remarks, and then I will then turn it over to Professor Ji after that for some response.
Thank you very much, Devin and Professor Ji, for this opportunity. I'm delighted. There is, I think, no better word for it, to see that the Chinese edition, the Chinese translation of this book, thanks to the labor and I'm sure hard work of Professor Ji, was made available. I presume it came out this month in July. So I'm very eager to have a copy, which hasn't yet reached me, but I very much hope that the publisher through Yale Press, which is the publisher of this book, is an English original, would be able to send me a copy so I can very proudly show it to some of my colleagues and also people who are interested in China, Iran world. I leave much of the discussion about this book to our conversation with Professor Ji, which I'm also delighted because normally in the course of conversations such as this, it's much more to the point issues can be brought out rather than me as a talking head here, particularly when you have a Zoom presentation. But I probably should say something about the structure of the book and its style, and probably a few words about why I decided to write this book before we would get into the actual substantive issues of what this book is all about. It is, as it's been said by a number of reviewers of this book in English language, it may appear that it's a kind of a conventional long-term coverage of 500 years of Iranian history. That is 1500, really 1501, the beginning of the Safavid Empire, all the way up to more or less the present time. That is around the year 2000 or 2010, probably as terminating the first decade after the Iranian Revolution, and a little bit beyond that. But in reality, it's something different. It's not purely a history of dynasties and wars and revolutions, although they are quite important, like any other history of a national history of a country with long ancient roots, such as China. This kind of political developments are quite important, as I pointed out in my introduction, in determining the nature, in determining the structure of developments and changes in all other areas. But perhaps we can talk about that slightly more later on. As far as the structure of the book is concerned, it consists of 4 parts. The first 2 parts covers from the 16th century to the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. And part 3, early part of the 20th century to the revolution of 1979. And part 4 actually covers the development of that resulted in the revolution of 1979, and of course the post-revolutionary time and the creation of the Islamic Republic. As I hope you would be able to, if you decided to study this book, you can see that this is in part something that developed out of my own teaching for a very long time at Yale. I taught history of the modern Middle East. I also taught history of early modern Middle East. That is from the time that I've just pointed out, from 17th century, 16th, 17th century onwards, both the Ottoman Empire, Iran, and to some extent, Mughal India. So I tried to actually place this study within this broader picture of regional empires that emerged in the course of the early modern and modern times, and the relationship between those empires and and Iran proper. Also, from the turn of the 19th century, more or less, onwards, Iran also experienced the presence of two great powers as its neighbors, the Russian Imperial Russia in its northern frontiers, and the British colonial India in its southeastern and southern borders, that is the Persian Gulf and what is today Pakistan and Afghanistan. And this was quite a new experience in the long history of Iran, as indeed it was for the history of China around the same time. And I cannot stop drawing parallels in many respects in the way that Iran, in the course of its modern experience, particularly its encounters with the West, had some similarities to China. And I became more convinced of that when I did actually study history of modern China to some extent, for the purpose of trying to structure my own book, including the work as although I didn't mention it in my introduction, I was very impressed and learned a great deal from my colleague, the late colleague, Professor Jonathan Spence, who probably was one of the greatest China specialists at the time in the world, and my colleague at Yale, who wrote this very famous book about Chinese early modern and modern history. And more or less, you can see the same kind of a format, that it worked very nicely for my book as well. I say it's not a conventional narrative, my book, because it does not limit itself purely to political events, to the rise and fall of the dynasties, to major wars and revolutions, although they do occupy a large part of my book, but also try to look at the socioeconomic trends in the country over this long period of time, questions of trade, agriculture, environment, but also at the same time at political and religious trends. I'm sorry, cultural and religious trends. So you would see a fair amount written about development of poetry, cinema in the 20th century. Development of, most significantly, Shiism as the official creed, official religion of Iran. Why and how it became part and parcel of Iranian identity over a long period of 5 centuries. So that's also, as it was said, and I was always delighted to hear that from people who reviewed this book, that it is something more comprehensive than just a political history. And more so, which was a huge challenge to the author, myself, is the fact that I don't mention these trends, whether political or military or commercial or cultural or religious. I don't mention them just for the sake of including them into my narrative, but as a matter of fact, I hope that I have been able to demonstrate some kind of a very profound functional interaction, and there is a reason for discussion of this poet or that movie, or talking about the major religious or philosophical trend of the period. All of them do play a part in trying to answer the major question, or one of the major questions in the book, and that's the old issue of the experience of modernity. How Iran, as an ancient culture that survived on the map of the world for a very long time, very few countries in the world, China included, that has always been there. It's not the byproduct of changes in modern history, but it's something that has always been there, either under the name of Persia or Iran. Try to show that this experience was a very complex one, very problematic in many respects, that the Iranian culture on the one hand remained very eager in order to modernize itself, in order to, there's always this urge for learning from the outside world. And this is both pre-modern and modern. And yet at the same time, there is an element of resistance against domination, against political domination, against economic domination, against even cultural domination. And it was not always very successful. I tend to agree with that, that this kind of an interaction with the Western world in particular remained a very problematic one up to the present. So in effect, one can see as some of the features of contemporary Iran that we witness today as many headlines in the news, in a sense, should be seen in this longer durée, this longer process of time, that how Iran has been exposed to certain positive as well as certain negative outcomes of this give and take with the outside world, particularly with the Western world in our time. So that being said, I think I can only add that probably in terms of the style and approach, I tried to present this book in such a way that it would be accessible, not only for the scholars, and I'm delighted to see that it has been now adopted for many college courses in the United States or in the UK, also probably in Canada, courses that either include Iran as part of their history or courses that are exclusively about Iran. So that's also very rewarding to see that the colleagues have accepted this as a important tool for teaching, but also accessible to the general public, not probably to the elementary level, but to the educated general public that are interested in issues of culture, issues of politics, contemporary relations, and of course, history. And I hope that I have succeeded in doing so. Part of it actually goes to Professor Ji to tell me whether that was a successful from the perspective of a translator, to try to access much of the material in this book. I'm delighted to hear that also the way that I tried not to model up my narrative with too many footnotes in the book. This book could have easily had, well, 1,000 footnotes or more. I tried to avoid doing that because I thought from the very early stages that if I do so, something more voluminous than what it is right now would come out. And also it may not be necessarily of great advantage to the reader. I have a section at the end of the book, which I don't know whether it's published in the Chinese edition or not, which is called Further Readings, that I've tried to cover every period in the book in terms of the available secondary literature in European languages. It does not include Persian. It does not include languages outside Europe, because it's outside my knowledge, really. But to the extent that if anybody would like to read more about any part of this, any episode within this book, there is a possibility to go back to that Further Readings. I'm also delighted to say that it was the experience of the publisher in Turkey, which is the Turkish edition of it just came out about 2 months ago. Here it is. And is very, according to friends whose modern Turkish are better than mine, are telling me that it's a good translation. And I'm delighted to see that now with the Chinese, I'm pretty sure it's going to be the same experience. I would probably should stop here. And then obviously, if there are more issues in the course of our conversation, I would be delighted to answer, both by Professor Ji, by Devin himself, or by our audience, obviously. Before Professor Ji I would very much be interested to see what was his experience with the actual translation, and something about the process as well. It would be, I think, is beneficial also to the audience. Thank you.
I'm very honorable to translate this great book, because Iran is a great culture, is a great civilization. And some Chinese scholars said Iran is another China in the Middle East.
Mm.
And China is another Iran in the East Asian.
Mm-hmm.
And because and so many Chinese scholars understand Iran deeply, lovely, and respectively. And because two cultures in history had a very friendly relationships, especially exchange and many cultures. And Iranian culture accept, receive many Chinese things, and at the same time, and Iranian culture still influenced Chinese ancient history. And today, even in Tibet, and Tibet, its ceremony still influenced by Iranian religions. And in Chinese Muslim, and many Chinese Muslims still use Farsi, Persian languages. And so Chinese scholars and feel Iran is my cousin, is a Chinese cousin, and something like this. So, and my question is, do you think and to something Iran is something like China? That's my question.
Okay, would you like me to answer it now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, I would have expected this question, and I would be delighted to answer that. The answer is very positive, given the fact that if we look at classical times, actually ancient and classical times, to the extent that my knowledge would allow me to explore that, China is probably the most referred to cultures of ancient and early modern times in Persian literature, in Persian history accounts. It was always looked upon as this ultimate model of a balanced culture. And that was always appreciated greatly in terms of its art in particular. There's much reference to Chinese paintings, although the tradition that Iranian developed and taught its Chinese was very imaginative. It was very much their own, but their elements from China is very much present in it. And this is, of course, no surprise, because the relations between China and Iran as two entities, two empires and two countries, at least goes back 2,200, 2,300 years. That is from the from the Achaemenid Empire when the Persian Empire expanded to Central Asia, northern Indian subcontinent, and to what is today Xinjiang. It became exposed very much to the much older culture of China. And from very beginning, it was appreciated that this is a unique interaction. And then it, of course, if you look all the way to perhaps 15th century, when still the trade between these two major sources of power was in practice, that is by the Timurid era in around 15th century, particularly in eastern parts of Iran, you can see that this interaction continues. One only needs to look at the major entries in, for instance, Encyclopedia Iranica, which is a major publication about the Iranian world and all the cultures that are in it interacted with over a very long period of time. There is a series of articles called Sino-Iranica in Encyclopedia Iranica, probably altogether more than 50 pages of very small print. And it basically reviews all these aspects that Professor Ji pointed out in terms of trade, in terms of language, in terms of various institutions of the state, in terms of the way that Iranians try to grasp a kind of sometimes imaginary China, sometimes a real China. Iran, in the course of the late antiquity, was the conduit through which Christianity reached northern China. The Nestorian Church, which is the indigenous Iranian church, Christian Iranian church of Western Iran, through missionaries moved to northern China. There were communities of Iranians both in North China and in South China that survived for quite a long time, and also were conduits of this interaction between the two empires. Iran was also exposed at some stage in its long history, that is in the course of the 13th and 14th centuries, to Mongol invasion the same way that China was also taken over by the Mongol Empire of Genghis Khan and its descendants. And there is a period in history, in late medieval history, that is basically from 14th to 15th centuries, and known as the, sometimes referred to as Pax Mongolica, that basically means this whole region comes under more or less there was a lot of competition within this system, but nevertheless, Mongol Chinese Empire and the Iranian Ilkhanid Empire had developed close relationships. And it's a very important period for both empires, particularly for Iran. That being said, also in modern times, we can see reflections of Chinese presence in the Iranian world for no other reason that after 1948, first of all, both China and Iran experienced at the same time a constitutional revolution at the turn of the 20th century. It's among the very few countries, at least in Eurasia, that experienced two revolutions in the course of the 20th century. Iran had a constitutional revolution in around 1906 to 1911. China's, I believe it was 1912. And of course, a Russian Empire that also experienced the revolution of 1905 and then the revolution of 1917. And both of them more or less went through the same convulsive course of history in this time period, including Iran, which my book covers in a full chapter about the Constitutional Revolution. But both of them, as a result of this experience of the revolution, went through the same process of becoming more critical and even sometimes hostile towards the Western world because of their experiences. And therefore, it's not a surprise to see that Iranians in the 20th century, in my own time, 1960s, 1970s, when I was in the college, you could see that there was a great degree of enthusiasm towards Maoist China, Maoist revolution. You could see that the Maoist trends in the 1960s and 70s were fairly significant in Iran. Sometimes even some of these revolutionaries ended up in China, and a couple of them actually wrote their experiences of time spent in China in this time period. And then this, after the revolution of 1979, increasingly, as we can see in today's relations between the two countries, has consolidated over a period of time. As a matter of fact, it consolidated since the Shah's time, this is the Pahlavi era, that first Iran developed. I think it was the second country, if I'm not wrong, I'm not a Chinese specialist, but I think the second or one of the very early countries after the United States opened up relations during Nixon administration with China. Iran was one of the earliest countries that took the initiative to develop relations with communist China, and that continued almost with no interruption, even with the revolution of 1979 up to the present. I mean, just as an anecdote, I tell you, I was exposed to this kind of an experience because my brother, who is a well-known architect in Iran, is the one who actually designed the Iranian embassy in Beijing. That is today, as I understand it, is somewhere of a tourist attraction because of its architecture, that he tried to develop a Persian architecture for the Beijing embassy. And it is still, of course, the center for the interaction between the two, diplomatic center for the interaction between the two countries. That being said, it seems to me, and that's my last point, it seems to me that today we are witnessing the emergence, for better or for worse, we are seeing the emergence of a new political sphere, a new political bloc, that it's emerging in this Eurasian world, with probably the major partners of it being China, also Russia, and Iran as a major partner in this process. That covers, if you look at it geopolitically, from the Persian Gulf all the way into the Black Sea, and from the other side all the way stretching into the Pacifics and into the heart of what generally was considered as the Orient or China proper. So this is a vast area with vast resources, and somewhat because of its posture, unfortunately, as being kind of in trouble with the Western world, seems to have developed some kind of a deeper affiliation within this block of countries. And perhaps it's, to certain respect, it's an inevitable process. You see, we are witnessing, in a sense, a shift from a course of history that starts really from the early modern times, from the Western explorations of the early modern times that came to dominate the Eastern world, including China and Iran and the whole of the Middle East. Now it seems that we witness a shift in this process, and we see something new in terms of geopolitical presence in that region. What comes out of it remains to be seen. But from the perspective of a historian, it's an important development.
And your answer is a very colorful lecture. That's a very long memory about the relationship between China and Iran. Thank you. And my second question is, it's said that Iran is a bridge between the East and the West. Do you agree with it?
Yes, I think I started my narrative in the introductory chapter by saying that for better or for worse, Iran geopolitically is situated in part of the world between Mediterranean world. It's not really Mediterranean at all, between the Mediterranean world, and it's not either Central Asian per se, or it's Indian subcontinent world, but it allows all of these trends to emerge, and there is a kind of a crossroad. As it has often been said, Iran is a crossroads of civilizations. It doesn't mean always this is something good, but because it was always exposed. If you look at the number of intrusions in terms of military takeover and invasion of the country, whether tribal invasion or modern armies, you see it has been all part and parcel of its history. So I would say so. On a more positive side, as I pointed out, this was a country that inevitably developed the art of adoption. And the fact that whether willingly or unwillingly, it absorbed much from the outside world. It's one of the best examples that nothing in world history is original. Everything comes from somewhere else. And despite all Iranian nationalism that sometimes goes, rather goes awry and imagines that something from ancient times was very original to Iran, there is plenty of stuff that has been give and take from cultures around it and from far distance. So in this respect, I would say, yes, both positively and perhaps less positively, it has experienced that. I just want to give you one example, and that's the example of cinema. Iranian world, of course, became conscious and start to make movies and films ever since 1930s, almost now close to a century of filmmaking. Almost from the beginning of the cinema, it fascinated Iranians. But in the post-revolutionary times, nobody would have expected that this particular medium becomes so significant as a voice of dissent in the country, as a new way of artistic expression, and as a way of trying to create some kind of a new realist cinema similar to that of Italy. If you talk to many of these or listen to many of these Iranian filmmakers from perhaps 60s to the present, you would be surprised to see how much influence of Italian cinema is there. Well, this is a country far away, but it learns and absorbs and try to make this something more internal and its own. And that's actually characteristic of today's cinema in Iran. That's one example. In poetry, you can see with Arabic poetry. I mean, as Iran became a Muslim country, Arabic became part and parcel of Iranian experience, influenced its language greatly. Persian was written in Arabic script, but it maintained its own character. Iranians is one of those countries that never abandoned their own language. This became modern Persian and Middle Persian and ancient Persian, all comes from the same root It's just continuity of the same tradition. So in that regard, it preserves something of its own, but it also learned a great deal from the experience of Islam. It's wrong to believe that the experience of Islam was something alien. It became over a long period of time part and parcel of Iranian identity and experience. So, but it has its own way of interpreting it that is different from its neighboring lands. That's why it is Shi'i, in part because it wanted to actually accentuate this difference with other experiences of Islam, without saying that which one is more advantageous to the other. I'm never saying that, but I'm saying that is an element of identity is buried inside the way that religion was accepted and expressed up to the present.
Wonderful, wonderful. And for the other scholars or students can give their own questions. Okay.
Great, thank you so much. We've got a couple questions from the audience. I don't know this person's name because their Zoom is only a bunch of numbers, but he's been waiting for a while patiently. Hi.
Hi, Professor. Can you
Yes.
can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Oh, thank you. First of all, I would say thank you so much for your speech today, and I appreciate your work, your hard work in Iran history.
Yes. Would you like me to respond to any particular point?
My question is, in many people's view, or many people think, perhaps a few people think, there a little democracy in modern Iran. However, from what I learned, Iran also has election. For example, the president of Iran is elected by the people. So my question is, what do you think about it?
Okay. Thank you so much. Professor Ji, would you like to add anything, or should I go ahead? Which one?
You please.
Okay, all right. Okay. Okay. Well, I suppose your question sums up as what is Iran's experience with democracy, and how successful it has been, the experience of democracy. The answer to that, the short answer, it was not very successful, given that Iran, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, has been struggling to create a more democratic, representative model of government. And some of these experiences for a short period of time were very successful, such as, but I would say short period of time, such as the constitutional revolution, as I said, which resulted in the creation of the Iranian parliament and the forging of the Iranian constitution. And for a period of time, engendering a form of democratic regime in Iran that survived really more or less up to 1921, or perhaps even 1925, for close to perhaps a decade and a half. what the experience of the constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1911 and beyond showed that how vulnerable this democracy could be, both to domestic and to international interventions. It goes without saying that the First World War that was fought not in Iran, but Iran inevitably was drawn into it, as I have explained in my book, was a major contributor to the weakening and eventually destruction of the experience of constitutional Iran in that time period. And the intervention, completely rude and unbelievable degree of a colonial expansionist intervention, both by the Russian Empire and by the British Empire in the north and in the south. And Iran has to deal with this too. And that did not open a ground for a calm and a suitable environment for a creation of a constitutional and a democratic regime. The second experience was the experience of the post-Second World War, after the two great powers invaded Iran, occupied Iran during the war, that is the British and the Russians, that is Soviet Union, and also the Americans as their third party of the allies who took over Iran. And after their evacuation, which is a long history, there is a chapter in my book, Iran, for a short period of time, experienced a period which I refer to as the chaotic democracy, of which the major feature of it was the struggle for gaining full control over its own economic resources, that is oil, during the period which often is referred to as oil nationalization movement or Mossadegh movement in the 1950s. And that also, unfortunately, due to the intervention by Western power, was aborted. But of course, in this case, you can say that it was not only the external forces, but also internal tensions within the country contributed to the weakening of democracy, as it did in the case of the constitutional revolution earlier on. And the third example is the example of the revolution of 1979, which was a revolution that came about, a popular revolution, probably is one of the greatest popular revolutions in the world. When millions of people came to the street, it was not just a change of regime at the top, but it was something that involved Iranian people with a lot of aspirations, with a lot of expectations for a better, more democratic, more free society to emerge out of the Pahlavi period. But unfortunately, that experience proved to be very short-lived, and soon, in matter of months, if not years, resulting to the emergence of another oppressive authoritarian regime in power, which is the Islamic Republic of today, Iran. So what we would see here, sometimes surprises myself that the period that Iranians basically switched between two authoritarian, oppressive regimes was less than a year. It's a few months, in matter of the Shah's gone in 1979 and Ayatollah Khomeini arrived in 1979. It's basically this continuity of the same process. It's a huge tragedy. But at the same time, if you want to look at the more, how should I say, hopeful signs, is that the Iranian society has not given up. We witness in Iran today, particularly with the younger generation of Iranians, that it is much more than the earlier generation, than my generation, really, open to learning from the outside world, to explore possibilities of reconciliation and the creation of a more democratic, more open society, civil rights for the individual, particularly for women, which has been the focus of much wrongdoing and much of oppression by the regime in today's Iran. So the future of Iran, I sometimes say, is in the hands of the women, basically, of the newer generation, of the younger generation. And there's so much signs of it visible around us that we can see in the way that women express themselves. Their discontent becomes more evident in today's society. I'm not saying that this is an imminent change, but is an important force.
Thank you, thank you. That's a wonderful answer. Another question?
Yes, we have another question. Leo,
That's the
You
last
can
one.
see also some questions here on,
Yeah.
on the question and answer. I don't know whether, Devin, you would like to handle those?
yeah. I'm gonna consolidate them all into something.
Sure.
But Liu Tianyo, go ahead.
Sir, I'm a high school student and I'm very interested in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And based on my knowledge of Iran during that period, Iran was very developed both economically by selling oil and culturally, and especially like it was a very open culture to both Western ideas and even to like much more modern ideas and forms of entertainment. But due to reasons that I could not understand, the nation suddenly turned for a religious rule and overthrew, I believe, is democratic government. It's either a democratic government or the rule of the king. I forgot the details, but it basically overthrew its old government and fall into a much more, perhaps, quote unquote, oppressive religious rule. And it also experienced a mass economic downturn due to foreign sanctions. So perhaps could you more expand on details on maybe how the nation having in such a good state suddenly turned for a state as we foreigners see as a worse condition than they were previously in?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for this very thoughtful question. First of all, I would remove the quotation marks around oppressive. It is oppressive. So the religious order, it hardly can be called religious, but ideological really, that has been superimposed on Iran is a very oppressive one. There's no doubt about it. But as far as what you've just said, that why the Iranian society, which at the end of the 20th century, 1970s, was advanced in many ways, would switch to something which, for all evidence that we have, is regressive, and quote unquote, you can call it backward. The answer to that is very, very complex. I would certainly suggest that you read some of my chapters in my book on part 3 and part 4, which tries to answer this question. Part of it is that nobody actually opted for a religious regime per se. Everybody was fascinated with a memory of this great leadership of the clergy in the past. And they thought what they have opted for is, in Ayatollah Khomeini, they can see a Mahatma Gandhi kind of a figure, that he comes and basically rescues Iran from the hands of this very oppressive Pahlavi regime, as it was portrayed at the time. And everybody, it was basically, it was governed by people's aspirations and hopes rather than actual reality, what they were opting for. And it took quite a while for them to recognize that the reality was very different from the expectations. But this is mostly from the Iranian middle classes that had experienced a secular culture for close to 75 years at least. Urban populations in the city, where generations like myself would have come, and my parents, my family. Whereas there was also Iran exposed in the period of the 1960s and 70s to a very important demographic revolution, by which I mean that the population in Iran grew in size. Mind you, China and Iran are two different worlds in terms of population. I mean, China had much greater resources, much greater population, much greater presence in its own region than Iran did. Iran was always exposed to all kinds of pandemics, problems, famines, lack of resources that never actually allowed it to develop a massive population. The only time that it did, in the middle of the 20th century, from 1960s onwards, it resulted from a shift of the population from the countryside into the major cities. That China also experienced, by the way. But China managed to observe it, to absorb it much better than Iran of the 1960s and 70s did. So you would also witness that the revolution of 1979 in Iran was carried on the shoulder of this dislocated population from the countryside to the cities. And their expectation was very different from the urban, secular, freedom-seeking, civil rights-seeking society in the cities. And that's what we see today. What we see today is, as a matter of fact, that small crust of population, the crust of ruling elite in Iran, basically was shaped from that countryside, from that experience of the population that came in the course of the 1960s and 70s to the cities and changed the nature of the city. It happens in many countries in the world. From the time of the Industrial Revolution in 19th century Europe, can see the same phenomenon, to Turkey of today, which also is witnessing the same thing. China, as I pointed out, is a very good example of the massive population that moved from the countryside to the cities. In the case of Iran, they readily were exploited, there is no other word for it, by a clerical establishment that managed not only to survive Pahlavi secularization, despite all the isolations that they went through, but also managed to develop much better ties with this disadvantaged, underprivileged population that has come to the cities than the Iranian intellectual population, the secular population in the cities. And that was the key to the success of the Islamic regime, even up to today. Basically, they grew on the shoulder of this generation that supports it, and still to some extent support it. Although we can argue that today that ruling class in Iran, ruling population, is a very thin crust compared to the majority of the population, compared to the majority of the Iranians who are extremely critical of what they can see around them for very good reasons. For reasons that they see that, as Professor Ji, I think, pointed out, the Iranian economy suffered, that Iran is in a much worse, in many respects, compared to what it used to be in the 1960s and 70s. But the course of world history, as some of you might know very well from your own personal experiences, is not something that it's always subject to reason. It's not rational. Things happen which is quite irrational. And this is one of them, that you see that the outcome of a revolution, in many respects, Iranian population today is a very different world from what it used to be in the 1950s, for instance, or let's say earlier on. I just give you some in terms of demographic changes in Iran. Iran of the 1950s, early 1950s, it had a population of 18 million. 1818. Population in today, Iran is 85 million, 84, 85 million. So this kind of an explosion of the population plays a very important part in how you would feed the people, how you would educate these people, how you would make life expectations, which is growing enormously. Once you are out of the village and into the city, you want more. You want better life. You want better life for your children. And all of this adds to the elements of discontent, both of the previous regime and the current regime in Iran. And the current regime in Iran is facing with profound problems, above all environmental, lack of natural resources, enormous amount of corruption, enormous amount of abuse of power, and misplaced priorities in today's world, today's regime in Iran. So you spent hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm not actually exaggerating, probably close to 100 billion Iranian has spent on the nuclear projects, whatever it is, the nature of it. Whereas the Iranian population, if you look at it, is in a desperate, desolate situation when it comes to the life of the ordinary people, facing enormous amount of inflation, enormous amount of poverty. Even within one generation, we can see that people have an experience of how they used to live and how they are living today. So all of these are forces of irrationality that cannot be explained in terms of how a regime could conduct itself. So they work for their own benefit. They don't work for the benefit of the majority population in the country. Even if they want to be more, I mean the regime in today's Iran, if they want to be beneficial to the general public, they are trapped themselves into their captive of a system that does not allow them to act the way that they should be for the best benefit of their own people. So that's a kind of an answer to a very complex question.
Thank you. And that was a great question because it encapsulates so much of different things that you cover in your book. So unfortunately, we are out of time. That's what happens when you try to squeeze 500 or thousands of years of history into 1 hour. But thank you very much, Professor Amanat, for some insightful discussion, and thank you, Professor Ji, for joining us and for allowing us to have this conversation. Thank you, audience, for joining us. As per tradition, we do take a group photo at the end. And so as many people as would like to join our group photo, please go ahead and turn on your camera so we can join in for a group photo together. And I will also unmute everybody so that you guys can thank both professors personally.
Let me, before we end, thank Professor Ji. I know what a labor it must have been to translate a 1,000-page book. And he showed us a glance of it in Chinese translation. Can you show it us again for a moment so I can at least see from the distance, how does it look, the cover? You had a copy there with you, yes?
Right, can you show the copy of the Chinese book? Of the
Yes,
translation.
and the translation.
Yeah, this.
Yeah, wonderful.
There it is. So
Yes, yes,
again,
This book is a twins of your own book. Twins.
thank you so much.
Chinese twins.
It's what?
a Chinese twin.
It's
Twins.
a Chinese way. Yes, yes, it may be very well. I would love to know more about it.
Because this book have the same mother and father.
Yeah, it is in Iran. It has been interpreted in so many ways. One way is the way that the religion and the state are two sisters. And this is the presentation of the two of them, like the two branches of a tree. They're basically grown into one another. So, but there are other interpretations about this word, next word. There are all kinds of dichotomy associated with it. But if there is one in Chinese, I would love to hear about it. Yes. Great.
Twins.
All right. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you, both of you, again, for joining us. Thank you for the audience for joining us. And thank you again to Duke Media for co-hosting this event. And we'll see what we can do about getting you that Chinese copy.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Devin, for facilitating this. And also my thanks to the publisher.
In the end, I should say, Iran is great nation. Iran is great civilization. And this book is great book. And its writer is a great historian. And I like that this book spreads and popular in China. Lets more and more Chinese people to understand the Iranian history and culture. And that's my responsibility. That's my immersion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate
so
it.
much.
Thank you.
And hopefully we will be able to bring Professor Amanat to China to visit in person soon.
I would hope so.
Okay, thank
Thank
you,
you.
everybody.